Thank you everyone for joining this evening. My name is Alexandra Callinan. I'm an associate lawyer at Mamann Sandaluk Kingwell in Toronto. Prior to becoming a lawyer, I actually worked at IRCC for a number of years. And so I have kind of a dual perspective on Canada's immigration system. And for tonight, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you just a high level overview of options for temporary and permanent residence. We don't have a very long time, and as some of you know, Canadian immigration system is quite complex and quite vast with many applications. So I am going to keep it quite high level for tonight's purposes, but I will try and leave lots of time at the end for questions, because I'm sure some of you have burning questions that you'd like to have answered tonight if possible. So the way I'd like to go through things today is I'm going to start off just with a very simple introduction to Canada's immigration system, the government departments that are involved in processing Canadian immigration applications. And from there, we'll move on to temporary residence. And in that section, I'm going to talk just generally about visitors and super visas for parents and grandparents. I'm going to also talk about students and applying for a study permit. And then we're also going to take a look at work permits, and we'll just have kind of again, a high level conversation about work permits that require LMIAs and then work permits that don't. Then we're going to move on to our permanent residence section for the evening, and we're going to start with the economic classes. And really for tonight, I'm going to focus on the express entry system. So the federal skilled worker class, the Canadian experience class, and the federal skilled trades program. Also talk briefly about provincial nomination programs. I haven't prepared any slides about specific programs or specific provinces programs, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end if you do have a question about, Saskatchewan or Ontario's program. And then we're going to finish off with family class sponsorships, looking at the spousal sponsorship category and the parents and grandparents. When we talk about the spousal and common law partner section, I'll also touch briefly on sponsoring your dependent children. As you probably noticed, what I'm not going to be talking about tonight is I'm not going to be going into Canadian refugee law or making asylum claims. I'm not talking about applications under humanitarian and compassionate grounds, and I'm not going to be talking about citizenship. We'll have to save those for another session. With the time we have, I just want to keep it strictly to immigration applications. So in case some of you haven't talked about or thought about Canadian immigration a lot before, the Canadian immigration applications are processed by two different government departments. First, we have Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, and the Canada Border Services Agency. You'll notice, as I'm sure many of you already have, Canadian immigration is just full of acronyms. So if at the end you have questions about an acronym I've used, please feel free to let me know. I sometimes slip into them without realizing. So IRCC processes applications that are made online or by paper by persons inside and outside of Canada. And the CBSA processes applications made by persons at the Canadian border. So if you're eligible to apply for your document at the Canadian border, then it'll be the CBSA who renders a decision on your application. So in general, Canadian immigration applications can be divided into two broad categories. The first of those being temporary residence applications, and the second being permanent residence. And as it sounds, temporary residence applications are made by people looking to come to Canada for a temporary period of time, and includes visitors, students, and workers. And the permanent residence applications, again, like it sounds, it's people who are looking to come to Canada permanently. And that includes applications primarily under the economic class through provincial nomination programs or through family class sponsorships. And now there's a lot of the time people will come here first as a temporary resident and then transition to permanent residence if and when they become eligible. And there's certainly many avenues open to you to do so. So under our first category of temporary residents, we have visitors. And visitors, again, are people looking to come to Canada for a temporary period of time, normally for tourist purposes, to reunite with family for a family visit, or for business visitors. And most travelers need a visitor visa, which is also called a temporary resident visa, or TRV, to travel to Canada. And in making a temporary resident visa application, this is a pretty, depending on where you're from and what your circumstances are, this is a pretty fulsome application where you're providing documentation to IRCC, confirming that you have, sufficient ties to your home country, that you have a legitimate reason to come to Canada, that you have enough money to support yourself while you're in Canada, and that you're going to leave at the end of your period of authorized stay. And right now we're seeing, for people looking at applying for a TRV or renewing your TRV if you're within Canada, we are seeing, really significant backlogs in Canada's immigration processing. The last I checked, the backlog was either 2.3 or 2.8 million applications. And so we're seeing, really significant processing times. Some of my clients are waiting, up to 6 months for their temporary resident visa, if not longer. So for people who don't require a full temporary resident visa, unless you're an American citizen, you're going to likely need an electronic travel authorization, or ETA. And this is like a mini TRV. You complete it online. It takes about 10 minutes to do. And you get a decision usually within about 24 hours. And it's a highly automated process. And unlike the TRV, you're not really uploading tons of documents to show that you're going to leave Canada, that you have, sufficient funds or anything like that. It's really much more of a self-declared process by which you briefly explain why you're coming to Canada, and, kind of general information about your background, but it's, a significantly less burdensome application. And you can check online through IRCC's website to determine whether you require a TRV or an ETA, and it's important to know which one you need. And so when IRCC is assessing a TRV, and sometimes sometimes a human gets involved with ETA applications as well, if there's a flag in the system for any reason, the primary assessment being done is whether the applicant will leave Canada at the end of their period of authorized stay. So IRCC is very concerned with making sure that people who say they're coming here as temporary residents are actually going to stay for only a temporary period of time. And so when you're preparing your TRV application, submitting documentation that shows you have really strong ties to your home country, such as, ongoing employment where your employer has authorized you to go on your 2-week or 2-month vacation to Canada. Involvement in community activities, if you are on a board of directors, if you volunteer with your church or with a sports club, these can be helpful documents to include. Your rental agreement or mortgage documents. These are all things I like to include to show IRCC, look, the person who's trying to come here has a full and rich life to go back to. And this can sometimes help the officer feel a bit more at ease in saying yes or approving your application. So a distinct category of visitors is a special program for parents and grandparents of Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And this is a program that IRCC introduced in order to allow foreign nationals to visit their children or grandchildren for up to 5 years at a time. And that was recently extended. It used to be a bit shorter, but now with the recent changes from IRCC, if you're approved for a super visa, you can arrive in Canada and have valid status as a visitor for 5 years. And this is kind of a nice option for people who may be waiting for the parent and grandparent sponsorship program to open up again. In the meantime, if you want to be in Canada with your kids or grandkids, and you are eligible and can meet the requirements of a super visa application, then this can be a good way to be reunited with your children and grandchildren until the parent and grandparent sponsorship program opens up again. And we'll talk more about that sponsorship program later in tonight's session. So the basic eligibility for this program is you need to be the parent or grandparent of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. You need to have a signed letter from your child or grandchild that's inviting you to stay with them in Canada, and they need to commit to financially supporting you while you're here. They also need to show the number of people in their household, and they need to confirm through supporting documents that they are a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. So their Canadian passport or permanent resident card, that's typically what you would upload to meet that requirement. Another distinct requirement of this category is you need to have medical insurance. from a Canadian insurance company. And I think actually that's been changed now. I think Canada is going to start recognizing insurance companies that are from outside of Canada shortly. And it needs to be valid for at least 1 year from the date that you're entering Canada. It needs to have at least 100,000 in emergency coverage, and you need to have shown that you've paid for that coverage in full. It can't be a quote you received from an insurance company. So this is kind of, there's an enhanced requirement. In addition to meeting the regular requirements for a temporary resident visa, you also have to meet these additional eligibility components. And for folks who would normally require an ETA and not a temporary resident visa, if you want to make use of the super visa program, you need to apply for a temporary resident visa before you come to Canada. These applications need to be made from outside of Canada. So for example, if you're an American citizen, normally you don't require a super visa or you don't require a TRV. But in this case, if you wanted to come to Canada and get that 5 years of status upon entry, you would need to make your super visa application before coming to Canada. Okay, so moving on to students. I know this is going pretty quickly and super high level, but we will have time for questions. So if there's something that I've missed with visitors, I'll be able to answer your question later on. So for students, foreign nationals looking to study in Canada require a study permit in most circumstances in order to be authorized to engage in studies. One of the main exceptions to this is if you are here as a minor child and your parent holds a work permit or a study permit themselves, then you can study at the primary or secondary level without a study permit. Sometimes secondary schools will want you to have a study permit anyways, but generally speaking, children of foreign workers and foreign students can study in Canada at the primary, secondary level without a study permit. And a study permit is a document issued by IRCC to foreign nationals authorizing them to study at a designated learning institution or DLI. And a DLI is a school approved by a provincial or territorial government to host international students. And IRCC maintains a list of designated learning institutions on their website. Each institution has a distinct DLI number, and it begins with O, and it has a series of 10 or 11 numbers afterwards. All primary and secondary schools in Canada are considered to be designated learning institutions, but at the post-secondary level, you really do need to go on IRCC's website to confirm whether the post-secondary institution you're looking to study at is a designated learning institution. Another important thing to keep in mind if you are looking to come here as a student is just because your post-secondary institution is considered to is a designated learning institution, it doesn't mean that you will be able to benefit from the postgraduate work permit program. And we'll touch on that program a little bit in our next section. So when you go on IRCC's website and you're checking your post-secondary institution, the first column is the school's name. The second column is the DLI or designated learning institution number. And then in the third column, it's going to say authorized or eligible for PGWPs. And if you want to make use of that postgraduate work permit program, make sure that it says yes. Sometimes, and I've seen this in my practice, clients will go to a private career college and they will see that it has a designated learning institution number and think they're good to go for the postgraduate work permit. But it turns out, or as they find out, a lot of private career colleges aren't actually authorized or aren't actually eligible, or they don't offer programs that are eligible for postgraduate work permit programs. And this also has implications for when you're making an application for permanent residence under express entry. So that's my sidebar on designated learning institutions and their numbers and postgraduate work permits. The main bit of documentary evidence that you have to procure in order to apply for a study permit is a letter of acceptance from this designated learning institution. And this letter of acceptance needs to clearly have your name on it, the program that you're going to be attending, and typically also IRCC wants to see whether you've paid for your tuition in part or in full, and the duration of your studies in Canada. Study permit applicants also have to show that they have sufficient financial resources to pay for their tuition in Canada. The full requirements of this vary quite a bit by country. And in general, it's okay for applicants to show that they're being supported by their parents or other family members to meet this financial requirement. So if you have an uncle or if your mom or dad is going to be helping you with your tuition, that's generally going to be satisfactory for IRCC's purposes. And when assessing study permit applications, IRCC evaluates whether the proposed program of study is a logical progression in the applicant studies. So what they want to see is, for example, if you did a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry already, and you applied to come to Canada to do a college level scientific technician diploma or another Bachelor of Science, specializing in chemistry, they're going to have some questions about why this makes sense for you in terms of job opportunities down the line, in terms of advancing your knowledge. So when you're looking to prepare your study permit application, and when you're looking at programs in Canada, it's a good idea to think about, does this genuinely improve my career prospects in my home country? Does it genuinely give me, knowledge or increase theoretical knowledge or practical knowledge or experience if you're doing a co-op placement than what I've already done? And are there any programs in my home country that are comparable to the one in Canada? Frequently, IRCC will do kind of their own country condition research and say, well, you could do a similar program in your home country. There's no need for you to come to Canada. So when you're looking at providing some supporting documentation to IRCC about this, it can sometimes hope to show when you're putting together your study plan that you've looked into other programs that may be similar in your home country and explain to IRCC why they're not good enough. Is the quality of the instructors known to not be to be poor? Are there simply no similar programs or similar educational institutions in your home country? That sort of thing. So that can sometimes prove to be very useful evidence to include. Again, IRCC is also going to look at whether the applicant can financially support themselves while in Canada. And as with all temporary residence applications, the IRCC, the officer deciding your application, is going to be looking at whether they're convinced that you'll leave Canada at the end of your studies. And this is a bit of a tricky point because, as I just mentioned, there is a work permit option for most post-secondary students who complete their studies in Canada, but you still, even though that work permit and potentially permanent residence option is available to you, you still have to include sufficient evidence to demonstrate, pretty strong ties to your home country. So this can be evidence of, a lot of your immediate family members are still in your home country. You potentially have the offer of a job upon completing your studies in Canada. If you're at a phase in your life where you own some property or have significant financial assets, then it's always good to include that sort of documentary evidence to show that you maintain really strong ties in your home country. Now, once you arrive in Canada, it's still open to you to apply for the postgraduate work permit if you're eligible. But on the front end of applying for your study permit, it really is a good idea to indicate that your intent to be in Canada is temporary. Okay, moving on to our section on workers. So similar to students, foreign nationals seeking to work in Canada must obtain a work permit before commencing their employment. And IRCC takes a really broad definition of what work is. It doesn't even necessarily need to be paid work. You could be doing unpaid work. And if you don't have the right work permit, it's possible that IRCC could find that you've worked without authorization. So the baseline test of whether you're engaging in work is whether you're entering into the Canadian economy and labor market. Are you doing something? Are you doing a job? Are you engaged in an unpaid apprenticeship or practicum that would potentially be open for a Canadian to do? Could a Canadian or permanent resident have done that job? Could a Canadian citizen or permanent resident done that practicum or unpaid internship? If the answer is yes, you're most likely engaged in work. And unless otherwise exempted, work permits may not be issued by IRCC unless a labor market impact assessment, or LMIA, is first obtained by the applicant's prospective employer. And an LMIA is a document that shows that there is a need for a foreign worker to fill the job, and that no Canadian worker or permanent resident is available to do that job. And the process of obtaining an LMIA is quite burdensome in that there's a mandatory recruitment period for most jobs where you're looking for an LMIA, and that recruitment period needs to last at least 30 days. The employer will likely have to interview some Canadian citizens or permanent residents, usually, not always. And then they're going to also have to attend an interview with Employment and Social Development Canada to explain why a foreign national or foreign worker is needed to do that job, to provide an overview of the recruitment efforts that they undertook in Canada and in their region, and to show the benefits that that foreign worker is going to give to their workplace. And those requirements vary, again, by the position or the type of LMIA that you're applying for, the type of position that you're seeking to fill. But generally, it's an expensive process. The employer is required to pay $1,000 per worker, and that fee cannot be passed on to the worker. It can't come off of your wages at a later date. And the interview process and the application process is quite invasive. ESDC has broad powers to look into the business's legitimacy, to their finances, to the recruitment that happened. And so this can be quite the undertaking. That being said, LMIAs are regularly issued. It's just a matter if this is the option that's going to be the best fit for you, finding an employer that's willing to go through this kind of rigorous administrative process. And again, I know I just mentioned this, but it is the employer's responsibility to apply for an LMIA. The worker is involved in it, and that they need to, provide them with their resume and their credentials. But the cost associated with applying for an LMIA cannot be passed on to the foreign worker. So that's just kind of something I've seen in my practice. Sometimes employers try to skirt around this rule, but it really is the employer's administrative responsibility and financial responsibility to obtain this LMIA. And so once an LMIA has been issued by ESDC, that's when the worker, the foreign national, can turn to IRCC and apply for a work permit. And to apply for an LMIA-based work permit, the foreign worker will need the following documents. You need a job offer letter confirming that the employer has extended a job to you, an employment contract, a formal employment contract that sets out your duties, your wages, the period of your employment, and kind of other relevant details. You need to provide a copy of the LMIA and the LMIA number. And when IRCC is assessing LMIA-based work permit applications, they look at, whether the applicant is qualified to do the job. So even if ESDC issues the LMIA, there's still this secondary assessment done by IRCC about the worker's qualifications. Do they have sufficient English or French language skills? If you're in the minority of cases where an LMIA is issued and English or French is not one of the languages required, do you have the right language skills for that role? Have you had sufficient previous work experience in this field? So there really is a thorough review of the applicant's education credentials, of their resume, of their previous work experience. If you can, it's good to include, previous employer references from previous jobs that you've held, definitely copies of any of your diplomas or degrees showing why you are the right fit for this job, because the IRCC is still doing a secondary assessment of that even after the LMIA is issued. Of course, they're going to make sure that an LMIA actually was approved. So that's, that's a matter of them reviewing the LMIA that you provided. And then again, as with all temporary residence applications, whether the applicant will leave Canada at the end of their period of authorized stay. In my experience, this assessment about, temporary intent, as it's called, whether you're going to leave as a temporary resident when your work permit expires, is somewhat less on work permit applications. There seems to be a bit of a less of a focus on this. But it's still a good idea to include, a self-declaration that you understand that you can only come as a temporary resident if you do maintain ties to your home country, if your parents are still in your home country, if you have any property that you're going to keep while you come to Canada. If you have a wife or kids who aren't going to be joining you right away, this can all be good information to include just to, meet that temporary intent component of your work permit. Okay, so the second category of work permits are the LMIA, or Labor Market Impact Assessment exempt work permits. And so there are some circumstances in which foreign workers may be issued a work permit without first having to have their employer obtain an LMIA. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but I'll list them off first. So there's a special program for Hong Kong residents seeking to come to Canada. There's an open work permit that's available to them. And when I say open work permit, that means you're not restricted to any employer or any occupation or any location in Canada. You can work for anyone, anywhere, doing basically anything. Citizens and sometimes permanent residents of countries with which Canada has entered into a free trade agreement. So you can think NAFTA, as it was formerly called, now it's CUSMA. We have free trade agreements with Chile, Peru. We have the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which deals with Australia, New Zealand, and a few other countries. And again, IRCC lists all of the countries that we've entered into a free trade agreement on their website. So when you're on their website, you can check and see if you're a permanent resident or citizen of one of those countries. It could be that there's a LMIA exempt work permit option for you. Persons who have obtained a provincial nomination certificate. So when we talk about provincial nomination programs a bit later, once you have obtained a provincial nomination certificate, you can use this to apply for a work permit without your employer having to obtain an LMIA. Many people go from having an LMIA-based work permit to getting a provincial nomination to then not needing another LMIA. People who are getting work permits under this category, it's not an open work permit. You're still going to be tied to the employer through which you got the provincial nomination certificate. One of the broadest categories of LMI exempt work permits are persons considered to be of significant benefit to Canadian interests. And it's under this category that Canada's post-graduation work permit program operates. So the postgraduate work permit is for people who've graduated from an eligible designated learning institution. Remember before I said just because it's a designated learning institution doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work for a postgraduate work permit. Postgraduate work permits are issued in length based on how long of a program you completed in Canada, and they can be issued anywhere from 1 year to 3 years in length, with a 3-year being the maximum. So even if you do a 4-year undergraduate program in Canada, you're only going to get a 3-year postgraduate work permit. And the benefit of the postgraduate work permit program is that it allows international students to get some skilled Canadian work experience to potentially help them when they apply for permanent residence through express entry. Another common category under the significant benefit LMIA exemption are for spouses of skilled workers and of full-time students. So if your spouse or common law partner is in Canada and they are a full-time student, or if they're working at a high skill level, so Canada ranks its skill levels according to National Occupation Codes or NOC codes. As of right now, those codes are divided by letters, so 0 A or B, but that's going to be changing quite shortly. So if your spouse is working at NOC level 0 A or B, then and their status is valid for at least 6 months in Canada, you could get an open work permit to come work in Canada for the same duration as their work permit. So those would be the two really big ones under significant benefit. There are also lots of other categories. Some of you may be familiar with things like intercompany transferees, or people with reciprocal employment. And if you have questions about those, then I'm happy to answer them at the end. Refugee claimants and persons under an unenforceable removal order, they also have an option for work permit. Certain permanent resident applicants in Canada who already have a work permit have submitted their permanent residence application. These are often referred to as bridging open work permits. There's an LMIA exemption for them. And then there's also open work permits that are LMIA exempt that are available for vulnerable workers or people who need a work permit for humanitarian reasons. Okay, so that was our kind of whirlwind tour of temporary residence options in Canada. Forgive me, it's getting a little bit dark. I'm based in Ottawa and it's gotten dark in here, so bear with me. Okay, now I can see a bit better. Sorry about that. So the first class of permanent residence applications is called the economic classes. And as you can see from this list, there are quite a few economic class options when it comes to permanent residence. For our purposes today, we're only going to be talking about express entry. This is kind of the bulk of Canada's permanent economic class applications. But as you can see below, there are options for startup businesses, for investors and self-employed persons. Some of this provincial nominees are considered economic, but I'm going to talk about them separately just because it's such a different process. There is the Atlantic Immigration Program, which has now been formalized. There's Caregiver Applications. There's a really great rural and northern immigration pilot program for people who are open to being outside of one of Canada's urban centers. There's an agri-food pilot for folks who have experience working in horticulture or in greenhouses. Also meat processing, this can be a good option for you. There was the temporary resident to permanent resident pathway. It's not currently open, but for people who were able to take advantage of it, it was a great program. And then the Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot is a program aimed at getting skilled refugees who have skilled work experience, giving them an option for permanent residence in Canada. And in my province, Ontario, they've been making quite a lot of use of this program lately. Okay, so express entry, how it works. So express entry is a multi-step program, and the very first thing you need to do if you're interested in applying under express entry is you have a bit of homework. So you have to complete English and or French language tests, a designated test. Usually on the English side, you're looking at IELTS or CELPIP, and on the French, you're looking at the TEF or TCF application tests. And you also have to obtain an education credential assessment for any education at the secondary level or above that you obtained outside of Canada. You cannot create an express entry profile until you have these two components completed. And for folks who are bilingual, who have strong English and French language skills, it is worth doing both of your language tests just because you benefit from a higher points allocation from having two strong test scores. If you're like me and do quite well in English, but are maybe so-so in French, it might not be, if you're not going to score well on your second language test, it might not be worth the kind of trouble and expense. But again, that can be personal preference. So once you've done your English and French language assessment, you have your education credential assessment, you also have to confirm that you're eligible under one of the classes of express entry or one of the categories. The three categories under express entry are the federal skilled worker class, the Canadian experience class, and the federal skilled trades. And I'm going to go into the eligibility requirements for each of those in just a moment. So assuming that you're eligible under one of those classes, the next step is to create and submit an express entry profile. And it's free to do. You can, typically you can do this yourself. Some people hire a lawyer or a consultant to do it, but depending on your level of comfortability, answering questions about yourself and your work experience, and if you have an okay attention to detail, then this might be something that you could consider doing on your own. If you don't have very strong attention to detail, or if you're just not comfortable kind of answering lots of questions about yourself, your work experience, your history, your education history, then that's when it might be helpful to have someone else get involved and to help you create your profile. And when you're creating your profile, it's really important to be accurate and truthful about what you are putting into the online form, because the information that you provide is going to form the basis of the points that you're allocated. And once you submit your profile, you're given a score, you're given a number of points. And what happens after that is on now about every 2 weeks, IRCC has thankfully resumed express entry draws. And if you meet the minimum points cutoff, you'll receive what's called an invitation to apply. And what that is you're said, great, you meet the minimum points cutoff based on the information you told us about yourself. Now we need you to provide all of these supporting documents to prove and confirm the information you told us. So if there is a discrepancy between what you declared in your profile and what your documents show, you could lose some points and you could have your application for permanent residence refused. So it's just important to be really detail oriented and really precise with the information you're declaring in your profile. And so, yeah, you submit your application for permanent residence, and then IRCC has indicated that they're going to try and stick to 6-month processing for PR applications, permanent residence applications. In my experience, it's probably going to take longer than 6 months. I think we're going to keep seeing closer to a year. Sometimes in that case is a bit longer. Okay, so the first category under express entry is the federal skilled worker class. This is really for people who don't have Canadian work experience. So what is required is 1 year of skilled work experience at the NOC 0 A or B in the previous 10 years. You need to have your English and French language test. It needs to have been taken within the last 2 years. If it's longer than 2 years, you're going to have to redo it. And you need to score at least a CLB7 in all 4 abilities. So in reading, speaking, writing, and listening. You need to have completed studies at the secondary level or higher. And ideally, it's at the post-secondary level. Secondary is like the very minimum requirement. And you need to have a valid education credential assessment for any of the studies that you did outside of Canada. And what that education credential assessment is, I didn't mention on the last slide, it's not another test or anything like that. You're providing your diploma and your transcripts to a third-party vendor, and they're confirming that your degree is, so you have a bachelor's degree, is equivalent to a bachelor's degree in Canada. Under the federal skilled worker class, you also need to show that you have sufficient settlement funds. IRCC just increased this for a single person. You're looking at just over 13,000, and it goes up based on your family size. So the more people you have in your family that are going to be joining you, the more settlement funds you need to show that you have available to you. And you also need to be admissible to Canada. And generally, when we talk about admissibility, we're thinking, do you have a criminal record? Do you have really significant medical needs that are going to be a burden on the healthcare system in Canada, as IRCC puts it? That's the type of assessment. That's the type of things you need to be thinking about when we talk about admissibility. The second category is for the Canadian experience class. And as it sounds, this is really good for people who have skilled work experience in Canada. And this is where obtaining a postgraduate work permit after completing your studies in Canada can be helpful. It lets you get some of this Canadian work experience. So you need to have 1 year of skilled work experience in the last 3 years. Your English or French language test, again, always within the last 2 years. And the minimum language score depends on what skill level you've been working at in Canada and that you're declaring on your application. So if you were working at a NOC level B, then your minimum score needs to be, your score is a CLB5. And if your work experience is at NOC 0 or A, you're looking at CLB7. Under the CEC, there's no education requirement, but again, the higher education that you have, especially if you obtained it in Canada, the higher point, the more points you're going to be awarded when you complete your express entry profile. And again, as with all applications, you need to be admissible to Canada. Okay, the third and final category of express entry is the Federal Skilled Trades Program. So in this, you need to have at least 2 years of full-time work experience or a combination of part-time experience within the last 5 years 5 years before you apply. Again, English or French language test last 2 years. The federal skilled trades is a little bit more specific. You need to receive at least a CLB4 in the reading and writing components and at least a CLB5 in the speaking and listening. And skilled trades for the purposes of this application fall into the following employment categories or groups. So, you're looking at the construction trades, maintenance and equipment operations, natural resources, manufacturing, chefs and cooks, and butchers and bakers. So this is still an okay option for people who have some skilled work experience in the trades. Okay, moving swiftly forward onto provincial nomination programs. Each province and territory has its own streams of programs and various requirements. Most provinces have something for the following groups. So you're usually going to see a program for recent international graduates, especially at the master's level. At least in Ontario, there's a stream for graduate students who've completed a program in Ontario. Usually most provinces something for business people or entrepreneurs, people who are looking to start up or buy an existing business in the province. And then there'll be various programs for either skilled or semi-skilled workers. Some provinces have streams specifically in the tech sector or other sectors where they've identified a need to fill labor market gaps in the province. Most streams require the applicant to have a job offer from an employer in the province. There's two exceptions to this. The province of Saskatchewan has a stream specifically for skilled workers outside of Canada that doesn't require a Canadian job offer or a job offer in Saskatchewan. Manitoba also has a stream that does not require a job offer from a Manitoba employer. And if you have questions about either one of those, I'll be happy to answer them at the end. Okay, so to be nominated by a province or territory, you must follow the instructions on their website and contact them directly. You'll notice that pretty much every province here is listed. The only province that doesn't have a formal provincial nomination program is Quebec. They have kind of separate Quebec immigration programs. And I should have said at the beginning, in addition to not doing refugee or citizenship law, then I'm also not talking about Quebec. That's outside of my zone of expertise. And in general, the way that provincial nomination programs work is it's almost like a two-step express entry at the federal level. You typically submit what's called an expression of interest to the province. They score you, you get points allocated to you by the province. They'll hold draws and rounds of invitations where you'll be issued an invitation to apply. You provide all of your supporting documents to the province. They review it. Some provinces are faster than others in their review. And then if everything goes well, you're issued a provincial nomination certificate. And that lets you do two things. It lets you apply for that LMIA exempt work permit that we discussed before, and it allows you to apply for permanent residence. And that application for permanent residence may be tied to express entry. So it may be tied to an express entry profile that you've created, or it'll be a separate provincial nomination application process. But in any event, your nomination certificate is good for both a work permit and for permanent residence, which is kind of nice. So it allows you to keep working in Canada while your permanent residence application is processed. Okay, we're going to move quickly through family class sponsorships. I'm just noticing the time here. So the last kind of broad category that I want to talk to you about today is family class sponsorships. And so the intent of the family class immigration program is to reunite Canadian citizens and their permanent residents with their close family members. And typically when we think about close family members, we're thinking spouse, common law partner, dependent children, and parents. Canada doesn't really have a regular sponsorship program for brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, that sort of thing. It really is just those immediate relatives. So family class sponsorship applications require the Canadian citizen or permanent resident, also in this case, they would be referred to as the sponsor, to sign an undertaking. And what that is it's an agreement with either the federal government or the provincial government to provide for the basic needs of their family members that they're sponsoring. And the purpose of this is to prevent the sponsored family members from having to go on social assistance while they're in Canada, after they arrive in Canada. And depending on who you're sponsoring, that undertaking or that commitment to provide for their basic needs lasts for different periods of time, typically from 3 to 5 years. And sponsorship applications involving spouses, common law partners or conjugal partners, and dependent children, so your spouse or your children, are given priority over all other family class categories. Okay, so the first big category that we see is the spouse or common law partner. I'm not going to get into conjugal relationships today. Again, if you have a question specifically about conjugal relationships, I'm happy to answer that at the end. For those of you wondering, what am I talking about conjugal relationships? These are people who can't enter into a formal marriage or can't do a common law relationship for really circumstances outside of their control. Sometimes this works for people who are divorced from their first spouse or are separated from their first spouse but can't get a divorce finalized and not have a genuine relationship with someone else. It's really kind of a tricky area of this category. In any event, the sponsorship eligibility requirements for the Canadian citizen or permanent resident are that they need to be at least 18 years old. They need to be at least a Canadian citizen, a person registered in Canada as an Indian under our Indian Act, or as a permanent resident. They need to be living in Canada. There's an exception for Canadian citizens. You can be living abroad and sponsor your spouse or common law partner, but you need to show and prove to the immigration officer that you intend to return to Canada. And you can't be receiving social assistance for a reason other than disability. So if you get support because you have a disability, that's fine. But if you're receiving social assistance that's not for disability, you're going to be ineligible to sponsor your spouse. Applicant eligibility. The applicant needs to be in a genuine marriage or common law relationship with the Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and they need to be admissible to Canada. And when we talk about the genuineness of a relationship, what IRCC is really concerned with here is, did you marry this person to become a permanent resident of Canada? And if they think you did, they're going to refuse your application. And often this is when a spousal sponsorship interview comes up. If the officer, for whatever reason, is not satisfied or has concerns about the genuineness of the relationship, that's when you could be called in for an interview with the visa officer who's adjudicating your case. Okay, I'm going to say quickly before I move on, sponsorship applications, you can make them inside Canada or outside Canada for the applicant. So if your spouse is living with you in Canada, you can apply and have them stay in Canada. There's an open work permit option for spouses who are in Canada, although I'll add the caveat that these spousal open work permits are taking a very long time to be issued. I've had clients who got their permanent residence applications approved before they got their spousal open work permit. So just something to keep in mind. Or you can file the application outside of Canada. If you file your application and the applicant is outside of Canada, you have a right to an appeal. So if the officer refuses it and you disagree with the decision, you can appeal it if you did an outside of Canada sponsorship. But if you did an inside Canada sponsorship, you have no appeal rights. So again, just something to keep in mind when you're deciding how you want to file your application. Okay, and I also want to add that the sponsorship requirements for spouses is very similar for children. In that there's no mandatory minimum income requirement. You just have to generally show that you're not on social assistance. Okay, so our last big topic for the night is the parent and grandparent sponsorship program. So the way that this has worked over the years has been kind of different iterations of this. The last time there was a parent and grandparent sponsorship opening, it was done in a really strange way. So there was one circumstance where you were entered into a lottery. There are some times where they did first come, first serve. I'm not sure what IRCC is going to do this time around. There hasn't been any sort of updates about what they're going to do for 2023. At this point, there's not going to be a formal reopening of in 2022. People who kind of got stuck in 2021 were issued invitations to apply already. But so the basic sponsorship eligibility is you have to be invited to apply. So whether IRCC does it as a lottery again or as first come, first serve, you would need to get an invitation to apply either way. Again, you have to be at least 18 years old. You need to be residing in Canada and be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. And the big difference is you have to have enough money to support the parents or grandparents you want to sponsor. And this is a formal income requirement that will need to be demonstrated with 3 years worth of tax returns from the Canada Revenue Agency. IRCC has the minimum income requirements posted on their website. They're updated usually every year. And the applicant eligibility, you need to be the parent or grandparent of an eligible sponsor related by blood or adoption. And then again, as with all applications, you need to provide all required forms and documents and additional information. Usually what it looks like for parents and grandparents is they want to do an additional medical exam. IRCC can be quite concerned about medical inadmissibility when it comes to some of our aging parents or grandparents. Okay, so that is a rapid fire overview of the Canadian immigration system. I went longer than I meant to, so I'm gonna let Demi open it up to questions now, and I'm gonna try and get to as many as I can.
Perfect. Well, Alex, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And attendees, if you have any questions for Alex, now is the time to type them in the chat or the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. I do see a couple questions in Q&A and chat, and I will start with the Q&A ones, and then we'll get to the chat question. So the first question, it says, is there any way the super visa parents can get work permit to work in Canada? There used to be a temporary policy about it in 2020. What is the position as of date?
Yes, so if you, the temporary policy now is before, if you were in Canada as a visitor, you would have to apply for your work permit from outside Canada. Now, that doesn't mean you need to physically leave Canada. You can apply outside of Canada online and be physically present in Canada, but then you would have to leave Canada and come back in to get your work permit. Now, what IRCC has done is they've said, okay, people here as a visitor, if you are eligible for a work permit category, you can apply from within Canada, but you still need to be eligible for a work permit category. So if you need to get an LMIA, you still need to get an LMIA. There isn't a special work permit specifically for parents or grandparents. It's more the application procedure has changed. You can apply from within Canada and you don't have to leave in order to get your work permit.
Perfect. Second question, can we apply super visa from inside Canada or a country other than your home country?
So again, when we talk about applying from inside Canada, you have to make your application, and when you apply online, you have to apply as if you were outside of Canada, even if you are here. You can apply from a country that's not your home country. So I'm going to give this example. Say you're a citizen of Australia, but you happen to be in New Zealand. You could stay in New Zealand and make your application. That's not a problem.
Perfect. And now moving on to the chat question. First one, it says, well, we have the deck, the slide deck available after the webinar. So I think I can answer this question. So this webinar is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube page so you can watch it there. And Alex, if you feel comfortable sharing your slide deck, we can also have it on our post-event email. Just let me know if you're comfortable with it.
Yeah, for sure. That's not a problem. Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, we will be sharing the slide decks with you guys in the post-event email. Okay, moving on to the second question. For people who already have valid TRVs, but did not get vaccinated with one of the Canada accepted vaccines, what can they do if they want to enter Canada? Can they apply for any authorization or exemption?
Yeah, so what Canada has done with this, you still can enter Canada. IRCC has posted their latest guidance on this on their website. You're gonna have to likely submit to quarantine. You're gonna be doing, you're gonna be required to do pre-arrival testing. So all of the requirements that were in place before for even vaccinated people are gonna apply to you. So it's not a total ban for people who aren't vaccinated anymore. It's just you're going to have to meet a series of other requirements that pertain to testing and potential quarantining if CBSA directs you to do so. If you'd like, I can pop into the chat the link, the latest link on this, if that would be helpful. Okay. I'll just post the link in here and I would follow that link. I'm not going to go further than that just because some of this guidance, it can change. So I'll give you the link and then you can review it.
Okay, the next question says, did I hear you say Americans don't need to apply for ETA visit for a short period?
So American citizens aren't required to obtain an ETA or a TRV. You can just show up. Bring your passport if you have it. Certain states will have like enhanced driver's licenses that sometimes CBSA will accept, but as an American citizen, you don't need to do any sort of pre-arrival ETA or TRV. The exemption to that or exception to that is if you want to make use of the super visa program, then you still need to apply for a visa and apply for the super visa before you get here.
Perfect. Next question. Is there an age limit for persons desiring to immigrate to Canada?
So there's not a formal age limit, but if you're looking to come under one of the economic classes, so express entry, anytime that there's a points assessment being done, so really anytime you move outside of like a family class sponsorship, the older you are, the less points you're going to be awarded. Canada has a bit of ageism in its immigration policies. They're really looking to attract young workers. So the older you are, and the points really do start declining after 35. That's why I call it ageist. It's a young time when people start losing points. So yeah, it's not a formal age cutoff, but you will start losing points as you get older. But sometimes that can be compensated for if you have really kind of prolific work experience and really strong language results. You know, it's still worth creating a profile in Express Entry to see where your points are at before completely ruling it out.
Perfect. Okay, the next question says, my parents have TRV since last year, but their passports will expire soon. Should they apply for the TRV again, or is there any way for them to use this previous visa?
So if they're going to be unable to travel to Canada before their passports expire, so if the TRV is still valid and their passports are only valid for like 2 days and they're not traveling to Canada, then yeah, they're going to need to apply again to have their TRV. To have their TRV placed into their new document. Sometimes IRCC will, if you're already in Canada, I've had clients be able to have their TRV put into new passports, but if you're outside of Canada, I think IRCC's preference is for you to reapply.
Okay. The next question says, from IRCC visa officer's perspective, what's their view on dual intent? If someone applies for a WP or TRV and he intends to apply for PR after entering Canada, should he be honest about his dual intent in his submission, or will this honesty most likely make him get rejected?
Oh gosh, yeah, I empathize with people with genuine dual intent. This will often depend on the visa office where you're applying. There's different quality offers globally. Some visa offices are better trained than others. The formal requirement for dual intent is to already have a PR application submitted and to then be coming to Canada as a temporary resident. So when you're applying, I think, you know, if it were to come up in an interview for any reason, like, do you intend to apply for PR down the line, and you're asked a direct question, you should always answer that honestly. Do you need to write, you know, lengthy submissions with a work permit application explaining how you want to apply for PR down the line? I would say no. If you want to mention it briefly, like, look, it's my understanding that I can use this Lmia-based job to apply for permanent residence, which I would like to do down the line, but I understand that I must leave Canada, or I can only stay in Canada for the length of the validity of my work permit. Here's all the evidence showing ties to my home country. That would be good, but I don't think you need to make the focus of any application you make your long-term plans in Canada. If you're applying for a temporary work permit in Canada, make your application about showing how you meet the requirements of that temporary work permit.
Perfect. So the next question says, what are the PNP programs in Saskatchewan and Manitoba that do not require a job offer?
Right. So Saskatchewan has, it's called an international skilled worker. And this is for people who don't have a job offer in Canada. It's an expression of interest-based program. So if you Google SINP, or if you go onto the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program website, you can see a more detailed eligibility grid and their points grid as well. So again, if you happen to have a family member or ties to Saskatchewan, it helps. But otherwise, if you have strong language scores, if you have good post-secondary education, if your work experience isn't on Saskatchewan, the only caveat with the Saskatchewan program is they have quite a lengthy excluded occupations list. And that means that if your work experience is on this list, then you can't really apply under this program. But if your work is not on this excluded occupations list, then this can be a good option for folks who don't have a job offer. In Manitoba, the specific name of the program is escaping me right now, but there's an option. If you have a relative in Manitoba, if you did studies or worked previously in Manitoba, or if you have, if Manitoba for whatever reason reaches out to you and invites you to apply. This can sometimes be done if you have an express entry profile where you've selected you'd be willing to live in Manitoba. Ontario does this too. They'll sometimes comb through the express entry profiles and invite people to apply to their provincial nomination programs. So I think it's called like Manitoba Connects, Manitoba Experience, and then the Manitoba Outreach. I can't remember the exact name, but both Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Saskatchewan's program is a bit more robust, I would say, because, or it may be a bit of an easier option since you don't need to necessarily show a connection to the province. You can do your expression of interest. If you have enough points, the next time they do the draw, you're going to be in that process to get your nomination certificate.
Okay, so due to the limited time we have, I'm going to ask you one last question that I think will be beneficial for all the attendees. And it says, what is the best way to know about immigration news and new programs?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. What is the best way to know about immigration news and new programs?
And new programs, right. So if you're on Twitter, follow IRCC on Twitter. They do so many updates via their social media, particularly on Twitter. They've had whole programs announced on Twitter before it ever came out on like the official IRCC government website. So that's a really good place to start. There also is something called program delivery updates. So if you were to Google IRCC program delivery updates, it will take you to their updates page. But really, IRCC has a healthy and active social media presence. And frankly, a lot of lawyers follow IRCC on social media as well to stay up to date. The way I start my day is I check their program delivery update page. I get sometimes they send like lawyers to emails to lawyers. They have a newsletter for lawyers, and I check their social media. That's how I do it anyways.
Perfect. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. Alex, do you have any final words of advice to share to our attendees?
Yeah, so I mean, as with everything, then it's important to stay up to date with the programs, be very detail oriented when you're preparing your applications. And if you do hire a representative, just make sure that there's someone that you really trust that is, either a regulated consultant, you can check their credentials, or a lawyer in good standing with whatever province or territory they're in. And just make sure you have, a good level of trust with the person you're using to represent you. And yeah, just, make sure you're doing your eligibility checks and keep going and put all the details you can in your application.